Yes, the lovely sounds of smooth jazz coming at you from Casa de Milagro. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Dulcimerica. My name is Bing Futch. Thank you very much for joining me. That's a tune called Lifeguard Station Number 19. I wrote it back in 1986 while sitting on Santa Monica Beach one evening. And, I found this trick just by messing around with the dulcimer of taking my double melody string and tuning those strings a fifth apart, and then just using that to constantly sort of have this smooth jazz thing happening. Little did I know, I didn't have to retune in order to make that happen. And that's what this episode is about. I'm going to talk about 10 chord types that live on your mountain dulcimer that'll help you to play more progressive, more sophisticated music and find all kinds of yummy colors. Before I go into that, though, I want to say hello and thank you to one of my patrons on Patreon, Brian Schilling. Brian, thank you very, very much for subscribing. I appreciate what you do for me every single day. And all of my patrons, that number is starting to tick up a little bit every single day. And during this really incredibly crazy time that we're all living in, I appreciate more than ever the support of my patrons and what they provide. The ability to stay at home, who has the choice, and write music, record music, create new tablature, develop lots of content for all of these people every single day. And I'm just very, very grateful and thankful to every single one of my patrons for that. So Brian, thank you, and thank you to all of you guys very, very much. Now, Patreon is sort of like a subscription service, like a streaming service like Hulu or Netflix or Disney Plus, and it just contains all of my work for the past 30 years. Books, CDs, videos, tablature, educational resources, all of it is yours for $5 per month. Plus, I produce new stuff every single week. So if you're interested in checking it out, please visit the link down below, patreon.com/BingFutch. And again, Brian, thank you very, very much. Today's lesson is about 10 chord types that you can wrap your head around. Some of them you know already, and some of them might be a good surprise, and hopefully you'll be able to use a lot of this stuff in your music. So let's start off with number 1, which is the major chord. Very, very simple. We play this a lot. This is going to be the first note of the scale, the third note of the scale, and the fifth note of the scale. And there are 3 naturally occurring major chords in every key that we play. In the key of D, those chords are D, G, and A. Major chords are up and happy. People love them. In fact, the 1-4-5 chord progression, which is basically all of the naturally occurring major chords in any key, that progression is one of the most popular progressions, if not the most popular progression in the world. Why? I think because people like to be happy. That's a happy sound. It's a wonderful thing. So knowing the character of chords is going to help you use them when you are trying to write new music or listening to music and trying to determine what the character or nature of a particular chord is. So it's very, very easy to find yourself a major chord. And if you're writing, if you want to write happy stuff or hopeful stuff or celebratory stuff, victorious stuff, using those major chords is great. But what if you want to reflect kind of the spirit of life, that sometimes things aren't always great or victorious or worth celebrating? Maybe it's something down and kind of serious, and maybe it's dark and somber and maybe sad. That's where your minor chords come in. So if you want to change the character of what's happening in your music, use some major chords and then throw some minor chords in to change the mood up. Have a lot more major chords than minor chords, obviously you'll have a lot more happiness and sunshine than you will doom and gloom and fire and brimstone. So having a balance of those elements is going to make you a lot more able to replicate what you hear and also take that and create new stuff as well. Number 2, the minor chord. We were just talking about it. The minor chord is kind of like a major chord. We've got our 3 pieces, the first note of the scale, the third note of the scale, the fifth note of the scale. But we're going to take that third note of the scale and take it down a half step. We're going to flatten it. And so what we end up having there is not a 3, but a minor 3, and that's what gives the minor chord its texture and its personality. So there are 3 minor chords that are naturally occurring for every key that we play in. And in the case of D major, those 3 minor chords are B minor, E minor, and F sharp minor. So if you played nothing but minor chords, you'd have a really serious, dark, and brooding tune happening. That's kind of deep and depressing a little bit there. So what if your mood is kind of dark and somber, but you want to show that there's maybe some light peeking through the clouds? So you play some of those minor chords and then throw a major in there just to show that everything's not maybe as bad as it seems. The magic of music. Number 3 is the dominant 7th chord. You probably see this written as a note letter, like D for example, and then the number 7 next to it. Now there are a number of different 7th chords out there, but the one that reigns supreme is the dominant 7th. And we call it the dominant 7th because when you build a chord using the scale notes off of the 5th scale degree, it's naturally occurring to have a dominant 7th chord. And so this has got a very strong pull, and it creates tension in the chord that likes to resolve, meaning it likes to be tense and then release. And music is a lot about tension and release. Sometimes there's no tension at all. Sometimes it's all tense. But a lot of times it's that balance between the two that makes a really compelling piece of music. So what exactly is a dominant 7th chord? Well, you take your major chord, the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th notes of the scale, and then you take the 7th note of that scale, and you take it down a half step, just like we did with that 3rd note. With a minor chord, we flatten that note to give us our minor flavor. So we're taking the 7th note of the scale, and we're flattening it in order to give us a 4-note chord called a dominant 7th chord. In the example of D, for example, D major is D, F sharp, and A. The 4th note in that, let's think about the 7th note of the D major scale. That's going to be C sharp. Take it down a half step, and we go from C sharp down to C natural. So if you play D, F sharp, A, and C natural, you will end up with a D7 chord. Now, if you've got 3 string choruses, how is this really supposed to happen? Well, you can drop one of the other notes out of the picture and replace it with the C. So if you have a 1.5 fret, one easy way to do this is to play 0, 1.5, and 2. What I'm playing here is D. I'm playing F sharp. So we've got the root of the chord, the 1 chord, or the 1 note. We've got F sharp, which is the 3rd note of the scale. And then I don't have an A in here at all. I'm going to replace the A, which is the 5th, with C, which is the flat 7th. So just with these 3 notes together, got a wonderful D7 chord there. One of the reasons I really like having the 1.5 fret. So let me talk about this for a second. With 3 strings, and even if you've got a 4-string dulcimer or a 5-string dulcimer, there are chords that have many more notes than we have fingers. Oh, not necessarily, but for playing on a string instrument, this is the case. So there are certain notes you're going to have to drop out, and you want to think about the most important notes that will make a big difference in the way your chord sounds. So I want you to think about the numbers 1, 3, and 7. And largely it's 3 and 7 that I want you to think about, those notes right there. Because if you think about the difference between a major chord and a minor chord, the only difference is what happens to the 3rd. We either have that 3rd, the 3rd note of the scale, or we have a minor 3rd where we flatten that 3rd note. With a 7th chord, there are a couple of different kinds we're going to look at right now. there's a dominant seventh chord, and then there's a major seventh chord where we alter the seventh note of the scale. So the 3 and the 7 are important, and you should always try and keep those in the chord because they're making the difference. You can get rid of the root and you can get rid of the fifth. There are a few times where the fifth is going to make a big difference, and we'll see that further on down the list. But 3 and 7 are your important notes. So if you have to sacrifice one note in a 4-note chord, think about sacrificing the root, the 1, or the fifth, the 5. So having said that, what is a dominant 7th chord good for? That tension loves to resolve to other chords, and it sounds really, really good. Listen to Amazing Grace with no 7th chords. And now I'll throw some 7th chords in there. So a 7th chord is sort of like a kiss on the cheek of the chord you're about to leave, and a big welcome embrace and some resolution to the chord that you're about to play. A lot of fun. Number 4 is the major 7th. So whenever you see a 7th chord written, you see D and number 7, that is normally assuming that you're playing a dominant 7th chord. That's using the flatted 7th note added to a major chord. But if you don't flatten the 7th and just leave that 7th note as it is, you end up with a major 7th chord, and that's written MAJ7 next to the note letter. That's got a more jazzy sound and is largely part of what you heard in Lifeguard Station number 19. So we've got a naturally occurring major chord and then a naturally occurring 7th note, a 4-note chord. So the 1, 3, 5, and 7 will create this sound. Once again, if you're playing 3 strings, obviously you can't play all 4 notes. So what we're doing is we're sacrificing the 5th in favor of the 7th. So let's take a look at where you can find this. Wherever you can play an L-shaped major chord, like G at 3, 3, 5. I got G on the bass string, that's the 1. I've got B on the melody string, that's the 3rd. I've got D on the middle string, that's the 5th, G, B, and D for a G major chord. So I'm going to get rid of the 5th, that D, and I'm going to move this instead to F sharp. F sharp is the 7th note of the G major scale. So that leaves us now with a lovely G major 7th chord. I can do the same thing with A major. So 4, 4, 6 and a half. I'm just going to move that finger up here to the 6.5 fret. And there we have another lovely major 7th chord. That's A major 7th right there. Isn't that sweet? And you can play a major 7th chord in place of a normal major chord just to add a little bit of sophistication to what you're doing. So wherever you've got an L-shaped major chord, try to change that pattern from an L shape to this other weird shape. And see, I'm using my pinky to get the bass string, and I'm using my index finger and thumb to go 2 frets up. And that's going to give you some fun that hopefully you can use an awful lot. Number 5 is the minor 7th chord. Now this is where we start getting into some really interesting combinations. We already looked at dominant 7th, which is a major chord with a flatted 7th note added to it for a 4-note chord. We looked at the major 7 chord, which is a major chord that has a 7th note added to it from the scale for a 4-note chord. Now we have a minor 7th chord. That's where we have a minor chord. So we talked about minor, that's going to be the 1, the flat 3rd, and the 5th. And then on top of that, we're going to add a flatted 7th note to it, and that's your minor 7. Now the same way that we could find this shape where you find the major chord lurking, you can find this shape lurking where the minor chords are hanging out. So if you've got a 2-2-4 F sharp minor chord, I'm going to go ahead and move my finger from here up to here. We're going to go 2 steps up from the 5th to the flat 7th. So once again, we're getting rid of the 5th and replacing it with the note that's going to change the character of this whole thing, the flat 7th. So this F sharp minor turns into an F sharp minor 7. And once again, the minor 7th chord can be used to replace a normal minor chord, just to give you an extra little special something something to jazz up your arrangement. Well, you've probably heard that sound before, and that brings us to number 6, the suspended chord. Now the suspended chord's a lot more simple than the ones we just dealt with. We're really talking about 3 notes once again, and what we're doing is we are taking a major chord, 1, 3, and 5, but we're taking the 3rd out of the picture and shifting it to a different note. We're shifting it either to the 4th note of the scale or the 2nd note of the scale as opposed to the 3rd note of the scale. So it still remains major generally, but we're adding some tension to it. Take, for example, I've got the 1.5 fret here, and I'm playing a G major chord, 3-1-0. So I've got G on the bass string, that's the root of the chord. I've got B on the middle string, that is the 3rd. I've got D on the melody string, and so I've got my 5th, G, B, and D. So what we're going to change is what's happening on the middle string. That's the 3rd note of the scale, B right there. The 4th note of the scale is C, and that we're talking about the G major scale because we're playing a G major chord. So if I move that B up to C, I have suspended the 3rd now to the 4th, and it sounds like this. That adds a bit of tension into the music. Not a real unpleasant tension, but there's a dissonance now in between the 4th note of the scale and the 5th note of the scale. Again, not terrible, not like a minor 2nd interval, which is like, crazy suspense, but just enough tension to give you a sensation of expectation. And then you can resolve back down and put the 3rd where it was. Now we can also take that down from B to A, which is the 2nd note of the G major scale. And that would be a suspended 2 chord. And these would be written G, SUS, 4 for a suspended 4 chord, or G, SUS, 2 for a suspended 2 chord. How would you use this? If you want to hang out on a chord for a very long period of time, but you want to introduce some tension and also a little bit of motion, you can go back and forth between a suspended 4 and a suspended 2 chord. Now, if you don't have the 1.5 fret, let me show you a fun way of doing that with an A chord. I'm going to play a real a 4-2-4 chord here. And if I move, and this is A major, so if I move the middle string from C sharp up to D, I get that same sort of sensation. So anytime you can move that 3rd note of the scale in the middle of your major chord, anytime you can shift that 3rd note to the 4th note or the 2nd note, you've got a suspended chord and a lovely way to bring in a little bit of pleasant tension and expectation into whatever it is that you're creating. Number 7 is the added 6th chord, or sometimes just called a major 6th chord. This is a major chord that has a 4th note added to it, and that is the 6th note of the scale. It's kind of amiable sounding thing, and in fact, the ukulele is tuned to an open 6 chord. It's a C6 tuned all the way across. So it's kind of happy. It's got a little bit of tension, but not a whole bunch, and it's got a nice coloration to it. So a good way of finding that is, this is a neat little trick. I'm going to go ahead and play 1, 3, 5 coming from G. And I'm going to play the octave as well. So bass string 3rd fret gives me my root. Middle string 1st fret gives me my 3rd. 3rd fret middle string gives me my 5th. Melody string at the 3rd fret gives me the octave. 1, 3, 5, 8. Now if I start walking down half steps, and you have to start thinking about chromatic intervals as opposed to just the diatonic intervals we talked about at the beginning of the episode, and that's a whole other episode unto itself, but I'll show you a couple here. I can go 1, 3, 5, 8. If I go down a half step, I will be at the major 7th interval. 1, 3, 5, 7. So if I play 3, 1, 2, I've got a major 7th chord. That's a G major 7th. If I go 1, 3, 5, flat 7, because I'm going down a half step, I got a narrow space there on the fretboard. All your narrow spaces are half steps, all your wide spaces are whole steps. Now I've got a G7, a dominant 7 chord. So 1, 3, 5, 6, there's the 6th note right there. So if I play 3, 1, 1, I have a G6 chord. And this is a lovely chord, and you can use it in place of a major chord with the same root. And I use this when I'm playing Colors of the Wind from the motion picture Pocahontas. Let me think. There's your G major 6 right there. Again, just another way of introducing a little bit of color into whatever it is that you're doing. The major 6 chord. Number 8 is the minor 6th chord. Now this is one of those chords where I really feel you kind of need to have all 4 notes present to make it happen. It's the stew that happens when you've got a recipe that involves these 4 notes. And if you drop something out of the picture, there's something missing or wanting or lacking. I also think it has a lot to do with the spectrum we've got between the bass string and the melody string. There's a lot of space there, a whole octave between 3 strings. So the voicings of the mountain dulcimer don't always lend themselves to putting these notes closer together so you can hear the relationships and get what you're looking for. That said, the minor 6th chord is great. You got a minor chord and you're going to add a major 6 as a 4th note to it. So a good example of that would be E minor 6, which is E, G, B, and C sharp. And you can get that by playing 5, 6, 6.5. Isn't that mysterious? That is some cool stuff there, especially if you invert it. Very, very dramatic. And if you ever use that in a progression where it becomes the minor 4, if you went to the 1, the 4, and the minor 4, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And we'll talk about that more in one episode where we deal more with that sort of thing. But I just wanted to put that out there because it is entirely possible to play one on the mountain dulcimer. Man, this is a lot of fun. And if it weren't for the augmented chord, there would never be any music in space. Why is that? Check this out. Don't you just picture a big star field out there? I mean, isn't that wonderful stuff? That's the augmented chord. And besides being used for space exploration, it's also good for a lot of stuff. What is an augmented chord? It's a major chord where the 5th has been raised up a half a step, or augmented. We can use flattened, and we can use sharpened, and we can also use diminished to mean going down a half step, and we can use augmented, meaning going up a half step. And that's what's going on here. Let's take a look at an A major chord, for example. I'm going to use a second inversion here, leading in from the bass string. I've got 4, 2, and 1. So I've got A on the bass string, C sharp on the middle string, and E on the melody string. E is our 5th in an A major chord. I'm going to raise that E up a half step now to F, courtesy of the 1.5 fret, and we have our augmented. Space, the eternal cosmos. But besides, portraying space, it can also be used as a function, sometimes a little bit like a 7th chord, a dominant 7th chord, to create tension and then release. One way I like to use that is by playing a augmented chord right before I go to the 1 chord. So it's serving as a dominant 7th in that crazy tone that you normally get from the 7th. We're now getting it from an augmented 5th before we head back into the 1 chord. And I use it in blues music, kind of like this. You can also hear that same sort of feeling in the Warner Brothers cartoons at the very end, right after Porky Pig says, "That's all, folks." Tension and release. And finally, number 10, we have the diminished chord. So in every key that we've got 7 different chords that we can play naturally occurring. We've got 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, and 1 diminished chord. And in the case of D major, that chord is C sharp diminished. You may have heard it, and you may not know exactly what to do with it, but basically it is a major chord where the 3rd and the 5th have both come down a half a step. It's very unusual sounding. It has a lot of tension. There's a tritone interval inside of that, and it's kind of crazy. So how do you use it? Sometimes you can use it in place of a dominant 7th chord. It serves sort of the same tonal function. So you can do all kinds of kind of fun stuff with it. I like to use it to move to an F major chord coming out of C sharp diminished. It's got a real nice resolution there. The thing is, it's really hard to get on a diatonic instrument, so we only have 1 instance of the diminished chord for the octave. But if you are playing a chromatic instrument, there are all kinds of diminished chords available, and they are very useful in doing a lot of stuff. All of these things could help you not only create your own music, but also when you're listening to a piece of music, it'll help you identify what exactly it is that you're hearing. Whether it be a major chord or a minor chord, something very simple, or something that's very useful, like a dominant 7th or a major 7th chord, or some of these other chords where you can kind of really complexify. Is that a word? I don't think it is. You can really make things more complex with your major 7ths, your minor 7ths, your major 6s, your minor 6s. And if you have a basic understanding of the 7 notes of the diatonic scale, and then go from there into learning all of the intervals in the chromatic scale, you'll learn a lot more that you can do with the mountain dulcimer, even if you don't have all the notes. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. I'll be back next week with more fun stuff to do in lockdown. Until then, keep playing.